Hi everybody, let's look at ancient Rome. Goals of today's lecture are to understand the great innovations of Roman architecture and how these innovations contributed to the expanse of the Roman Empire, explore Pompeii for its information about Roman art and architecture, examine the types, methods, and subject matter of Roman wall painting, understand what Roman portraiture says about Roman society, understand the political nature of Roman art and architecture, especially as it communicates ideas of power for the emperor and empire. Examine changes in Roman art and architecture as a result of the expansion of the Roman Empire and the incorporation of the conquered cultures. So ancient Rome is very influenced by what the Greeks establish. The Romans adapted a lot of Greek ideas, their art, their architecture, and even the form of government, the elected representatives to create a senate. That all comes from Athenian democracy, right? The rule of the people, which is based in those humanist, principles. That, of course, humans can rule themselves. So, after 509 BCE, the Romans took great pride in the Republic. The soldiers marched with a banner not of a king, but of or ruler of any kind, but actually of the Senate. So here, as we look at Rome at its actual height through the map here, you can see its massive stretch. It reached from Scotland all the way, when we look east, to Baghdad. It's a huge spread and a huge population. There were many large, important cities outside of just Rome itself. The Romans they're also really developing and progressing engineering. And this is really key and important to think about within the Roman Empire. Within these cities, things like roads, sewage systems underground, sports arenas, shopping malls, and even the concept of larger buildings to service the larger populations. We look at the Roman Empire eras and is an overview here. And it's important to remember that Rome is first ruled by the Etruscans, like we went over in our past lecture last week. This culture that we looked at before, the Etruscans, will have, just like the Greeks, a large influence on the Romans as well. So as the Etruscan rule is overthrown and the Republic begins, this lasts until around the 1st century AD, when Rome spreads and expands and becomes at the height of its empire. So we're going to start here by looking at that republic as it's in its earlier stages. This is a recreation of the city of Rome itself. So despite the influence of both the Greeks and Etruscans, like I just mentioned, the Romans work here on a scale way beyond either of those cultures' influences. The Romans became masters at utilizing and sourcing materials and methods of construction. In about 211 BCE, General Marcus Marsilius conquers the Greek city of Syracuse and brings back a lot of Greek art, writing, philosophy. This begins what historians call a craze for Greek works. So, picking a specific temple to look at, this is actually a small temple located in Rome, dedicated to the god Portunus, which is the god of harbors. You can see the Greek pediment top there, the Greek Ionic columns. Specifically, you can tell that by the capitals. And like the Etruscan temples we looked at, if you look at the bottom there's a raised base, right? So it's up off the ground, and a porch area under those columns before we get to the entrance, the actual door entrance to the temple. Notice the Greek influence here. Another Greek influence is that this is made from marble, right? So if we look on the side for your image there on the left, you'll notice there is kind of a compromise between the Etruscan and the Greek cultures. So in Greek culture, we would see something that would those columns would go all the way around, and we'd have that porch that would follow all the way around the building. That's what we call a colonnade, where the columns go 360. So in the Etruscan temples, I know the kind of general example in the model image we looked at last week, both in class and in the lecture, we can only see it from the front. However, we did talk about how the columns did not wrap around. Here you'll notice they go around, but they're not serving necessarily the function of course, holding up the building over a porch. So in this case, the columns serve more as a facade, right? Something that's not structurally holding it in place, but actually kind of just built into the wall. This is this is kind of, I guess you would say they're embedded into the wall, and those are called an engaged column. So when you see columns like that are embedded right into the wall, kind of looks like just for show, that's what that's called, embedded columns. And you can remember that this is a mashup of Greek and Etruscan art. This is Sanctuary of There we go. This is the Sanctuary of Prima Genia, which is the goddess of luck. This comes from the late 2nd century BCE, and this is a remarkable example of civic architecture. Architecture meant to serve a whole big group of people. This is a huge temple, was also a theater and a shopping mall, all kind of melded into one. This is built into a hillside and constructed with a series of ramps and stairways. As you can see, the stairways kind of straight down the middle, and the ramps, they're kind of just going off screen here, but if we look to either the right and left, the entry point from getting up off of the ground there as the right and left kind of slope down and make kind of a triangular shape. Those are ramps that kind of go up. So there's both walkways, ramp, and then also these staircases. But it's built into a hillside as well, so you can kind of see how that elevates it naturally. The inclusion of those many paths and kind of directing traffic, essentially, of people, that's going to be something you're going to see as a common element, a common motif in Roman architecture. Romans would also often use concrete for their structure. Sometimes they used brick and then covered it with concrete. They would then embed stones and pebbles into the concrete walls to create a kind of textural effect known as opus incertum. And there you can see on the very bottom, I know it's small, but it's a real life picture, whereas we were looking from a model. So where I mentioned that the rampways existed are going to be in that kind of triangular space there on the right and left. This just explains a little bit more about the building of the Fortuna Primigenia. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the Roman architectural innovations. Romans advanced the post-lintel structure, right, by mass producing the arch. We talked about that post-lintel structure in the very first lecture, or actually the second lecture, about Neolithic art. We talked about that especially just around kind of Stonehenge, right? Just before we talked about Stonehenge, the posts being the kind of verticals, and the lintel being that kind of horizontal that goes across it. Now, the arch, as we talked about a few weeks ago, had been advanced in other cultures, but the Romans really brought it to and kind of really decided about how they could use it in many different ways. So, what makes the arch? That's kind of the key here, is to talk about a little bit more about the arch. What makes it so important? Well, an arch is made up of various trapezoidal cut stones. They're called a voussoir, and the central one is called the keystone. When a weight comes from above, as you can see if you're looking at A there, you can see if weight were to kind of rest right on top of the arch, the keystone being right in the center there, the center of the arch, what that does is it distributes the weight evenly across the left and right. This is different than the lintel, which is lying flat. So if we can imagine there for a second, if we're looking at A, and instead of that nice arch, we had a flat wall there on top. Eventually, if something's heavy enough, it's going to weigh down in the middle, and that could either bend or break. But in this case with the arch, because it's raised up and then curved, and you have that kind of even weight because you have the even amount of stones or whatever material you're using for your voussoir, right? That keystone in the center will distribute the weight to the left and to the right. It won't just try to hold all the weight itself. And that is what makes an arch work better than the post-lintel structure. Okay. The Romans also realized you could stretch an arch long ways, and that's called a barrel vault. Or you could interconnect arches into a groin vault. Or you could introduce windows and utilize the arch to make larger clerestory windows. Or you could continue an arch 360 degrees, as you can see in D there, and turn it on its side and create a dome. So all of these structures are related and derived from the arch. If we're looking at C at the bottom, you can see those clerestory windows, right? You can see how they're, before we saw clerestory windows in a more recto linear format, right? So you're limiting light to come in then in that shape. The arch lets light come in a fuller shape, and it can come in through then the window panes, which of course you could create a grid like you can see there on C. There's a grid, the panes themselves. So light, of course, also the elements are coming through that space and just kind of condensed and shaped by the window panes themselves. In B, we see, of course, a groin vault, which is like the crossing, right, of the arches, crossing of the vault. So that's another way to kind of, just like we talked about individually on one arch, how it kind of contains or holds the strength of a structure. Well, now you've got, by connecting two, and you're connecting them in the middle, you're resulting to have 4 arches there. And by having all 4, you're kind of putting your powers combining there. So you're going to be able to hold a lot more weight if you were to build on top. If we look into the sculpture of the time, the kind of Republican era of Rome, let's look at one to start here. So what is this all about? What is sculpture all about in Roman era? We talked a lot last week about the Etruscans versus the Greeks. So of course, both are influencing directly Roman sculpture here. Greek so far, just straight off in its material, right? This is made of marble. So we're looking at the Greeks' use of marble. Also, the Greeks' use of that idea of realism, right? But what is maybe different? Well, perhaps you could say the lack of idealism. So this is the same time as classical Greek sculpture. So we haven't reached Hellenic yet. So classical Greek sculpture is all about glorifying the ideal body, glorifying the ideal human. So especially in the faces, Romans used what is known as verism, right? Which is, we talked about that I think last week as well, but that's called truthfulness. Verism is the idea of representing something as true as you can to life. The Romans are often trying to portray important societal figures. Also, a goal and a key here is to portray family members, past family members. So the Romans place a high importance on ancestral worship. It was tied into the religion. So on some holidays, people would parade around holding sculptures of their ancestors. Remember, of course, at the time there was no pictures, so a sculpture is how folks would hold on to an image of someone, kind of just try to remember, right? The actual how they looked. This sculpture we see here is just of that. So the man looks like he's holding a couple heads, but there, if we notice, we look closely, those heads are shaped at the bottom, so they're shaped to be busts, so they're not actually, it's not supposed to represent the man holding physical heads, but rather he is holding sculptures. So in this sculpture, it is a sculpture of a man holding two sculptures, right? He's holding busts of his ancestors, and this is a way, was common as a way of honoring them, not just the having them, but also holding them, parading them around in certain kind of holidays. So the truthfulness is the goal that, the idea of capturing someone's likeness so you can honor them and specifically remember their truth. Okay, so how they looked in the world, right? And trying to kind of keep them there, in a certain way of preserving how they looked. In this portrait, let's go one more here. In this portrait, we see, again, an attention to detail. It should be said that it often didn't carry, though, into the body. So as older men's heads would be sculpted onto young athletic bodies. As you can see, I know it's a little ruined there in the front, but and the nose is kind of broken off, but we can tell that just by the kind of, that looks like the hair is starting to recede a little bit. Again, chopped off at the head, so you can't quite tell, but just based on where that kind of hair falls. Also, just the furrowed brow, looks like some lines and a weight at the kind of the base of the head, which all signifies someone more middle-aged, right? Someone who's, again, just the way that the eyes are sunken, it's more specific, so it looks like a person, a distinguished person, versus some of those archaic Greek sculptures and Etruscan sculptures we looked at that were very, very kind of just like the Egyptians, right? They were one size fits all. One face is kind of just being basically transported onto each sculpture. In this case, that's a very specific person, very specific face, but it's put onto this very idealistic, young, athletic body, which at the time, this general would have been older, and it probably wouldn't have represented his body in that way. So, though we're seeing the more truthfulness, the verism in the face, we're not necessarily seeing that continue on to the bodies. So again, here we see just something we didn't see at all in Greek, especially in the classical age. We're seeing all these lines in the face, right? The realism and the realism of aging, the realism of, again, the receding hairline, the realism of the face, the way a person ages, and how that can really kind of actually represent them. So if we look at this, kind of just comparing this to previous cultures, thinking about how that age looks different. That age looks different when we're looking at those different sculptures compared to this kind of overly detailed truthfulness. Also, in this kind of same way, though it is smaller here on a coin, Julius Caesar was the first to place his own portrait on Roman coinage during his lifetime. So which starts this kind of course, trend of that idea of putting the ruler, putting the ruler to signify the time, right, on the actual, in this case, the money. So here, though, even on this, we see the lines on the neck, right? We just see a little bit more definition in the face. All of this is to signify that he's a real person. He's not just this kind of, again, one face fits all image. Romans kept slaves. By the end of the Republican period, there was something like 2 million slaves. People would be forced into this sometimes to pay a debt or just in conquest. However, sometimes people could eventually buy their own freedom. Despite this, they usually, not always, but usually kept their former owner's name. What we see here is the art of former slaves. So this is a funerary relief, right? Made by the slaves here, and the two men on the left and right are former slaves of the man in the middle. So in this case, Publius Gessius is the man in the middle, and that so therefore Gessius is his last name. That is then taken on as the first name of the man on the left and the right. The portrait also then becomes very important in Roman society, right? So taking that idea of not just the full body sculpture, but thinking about the portrait in general. I'm going to show you one more image here. Idea of kind of non-elite portraiture, right? So made by slaves rather. We're looking then at, in this case, also notice the bodies are a lot more squat, right? The proportions don't quite seem as idealized or perhaps even as accurate in some cases. On the upper left side, there's 3 figures. There's 6 total figures there on the upper left side. The 3 figures closest to the figure laying down. We see some outstretched arms. They look a little long, maybe for the arms, and then the folks that are just behind, the 3 that are in the corner, look all of a sudden really squished and small in that space. Right below them, there's 2 that also feel kind of squished and almost fit to those little architectural, blocks that they're standing on. So the idea here, this art and the art then in this case made by the slaves, but also just doesn't even matter that they're slaves versus non-slaves, that they're commoners. They're just the idea that they're not educated in this kind of school of art, the school of verism, right? And that becomes something to kind of keep in mind as we move on. We're going to see that as a motif going forward. Before I move on to the early empire, just bringing up this again, this idea that the portrait, what I started to say about the portrait, around the 1st century, Rome moves into a republic. So it's just kind of in that time they now have an emperor, right? Which is why it's going to be called the empire. This is just an interesting thing to connect to the humanism of it. How is that changing? How is that not changing? So keep that in mind as we move forward. So to talk about this kind of early republic, we have to talk about Pompey. I should also say, as I'm getting into Pompey here, that they, in this kind of as it changes, Rome changes to an empire and they've got emperors, they still have a Senate, right? So the Senate still exists. It still has technical power of law creating and kind of elected. There's still an elected component to Roman society in that Senate. But we do see a fair amount of changes. And that, of course, comes with having a figurehead in society. Now, Pompey. Why are we talking about Pompey? It was actually, as we can see there on the map, pretty far from Rome. Not necessarily in the scale of how large the empire was, but within that kind of Italy peninsula there. It's kind of farther away from Rome. It certainly was a smaller city-state. It was not a big, it was more rural. It was not a big kind of urban environment like Rome. It's most famous for in 79 AD, the volcano Vesuvius erupted, leaving the city buried in a layer of ash. So this is both a very tragic and horrific event, but it's also very important for the excavation purposes because the city was left almost completely intact under that ash. The bodies you see here in this image are not statues, but they're actual bodies that preserved, they kind of preserved their form because they became hardened ash. The ash kind of fell onto them, and then, of course, from so much time, the ash and the body's decomposition just became into one. So this event happened so suddenly that people were out walking their dogs, doing mundane tasks when this happened. And so that's why we see, if you look through images or find images of Pompeii, you'll find very surreal, horrifying, but also surreal things where people were just kind of frozen in time, frozen in what they were doing. You'll see that figure in the very far back. He's leaning up, right? So he actually got kind of, other people are taking cover, right? They had a moment to maybe make embraces, but certain people might have not had that time, especially if they're older and they're trying to move slowly. So it's quite a unique and, again, horrifying event. However, when we think about Pompeii itself, Pompeii was, again, relatively provincial, not a big place, but its importance is just that it's what we have. It's what we have from the time. And it was so well intact that it really does give us a lot of information about the rest of the area. So, and the time. So unfortunately, though, it wasn't filled with nearly as much as Rome was. Art and architecture certainly wasn't as big. But, you know, if we think about the comparison between it and Rome has been such a big, important place in all the years and decades since. So there are very few Roman sculptures that are preserved. But Pompeii really serves as a snapshot of the time and of the late Republican, early imperial period. So what we're looking at here is an overview of the Forum of Pompeii. The Forum is the center, both political, religious, and most often physical center of a town. If we go here to number 2, the far number there, that is the temple, which is the temple of Jupiter, the god Jupiter, and it's also known as the Capitolium. Number 1 in the kind of center there is the Forum and general kind of marketplace area. And number 3 in the bottom left is the Basilica. The Basilica is another large-scale public building. One of the main public structures built in Pompeii is the amphitheater. Amp means to double or kind of make twice. So the idea of an amphitheater is to, I should say back to that word amp, is to like double the volume of something. So when we talk about that in the theater, it's the idea of making it double the size, right? Theater. So the theater was created by piling up in the middle there. You can see the dirt, and then you created kind of an earthen bowl there within it. Within that kind of concrete structure from the outside. Seats were then built on top of the earth, so they were solidly on there, and they were called lunius. Exits and entrance, cuneus, exits and entrances were also designed just like we talked about earlier. Romans are very specific about keeping the crowd control idea of your design. So there was pathways are present here. Concrete was used on the outer wall, and these outer walls are designed with what's called a blind arcade. I'm going to show you can see just a little in the kind of towards the bottom right, you can see a little bit of that. You can see those columns making arches there on the bottom. I'm going to show you an image of a painting. This is a painting that was discovered in a house actually in Pompeii, but you can see those arches in the painting are going up, and there's a little bit of, if it's not clear, there's only a little bit of space. So the arches were, it's called a blind arcade because you could not actually enter in some of those arches, right? So there's a line of those arches that were just for show in the front of the Colosseum there, and then on one of the sides there was a place where you could enter. So row of arches is called an arcade. If they're just for decorative purposes, it's referred to as a blind arcade. So sporting events took place in these amphitheaters. What we're looking at here, again, I've just mentioned, it's from a house. It's a fresco, so that fresco which we talked about last week, but that's from a house in Pompeii, and it depicts a big brawl that took place during an event in this amphitheater. At the very top of the image, you see a kind of large cloth. That's just at the very top above where you see them kind of fighting within the amphitheater. That cloth is called a velcrium, and it could be pulled over top of the Colosseum to provide shade. The amphitheater could hold some 20,000 people, and this was a very large bit of fabric then that you had to reach over all of that space. A building with these innovations was not something that Egyptians, Greeks could have pulled off. So, Pompeii gives us this insight into all the little details here of how we can see really just the engineering of Roman architecture. If we look at Roman houses, this would have been outside the city of Rome, as Rome itself was too densely organized for folks to have had houses, and people in Rome lived in apartments. This is a typical late Republican, early Imperial era house. Not only did people live in the houses, but they were often businesses. So the front rooms were, if we can see on that kind of chart there with all the numbers, we can see maybe kind of towards 1. The front rooms there, perhaps on the right and left, could be businesses by either the family that lived in the house, or they might be rented out to others that were going to come in and just work within the house. So just talking and kind of breaking down the space, the entryway was known as the fauces, or throat of the house, number 1. And the meeting area is mostly called the atrium. So there's number 2, right around number 3 there, which is that kind of it was a basin for water, and they're called the impluvium, the water basin. So off to the side, you had the cubicum, which are the bedrooms. So those are 4 there, kind of labeled around. Of course, where we get cubicle from. Number 5, you have a place for ancestor shrines. Again, they're worshiping their ancestors. They're really kind of exalting their ancestors. It's called the ala. Then you have 6, which is an office area, the tablinum. And then number 7 is the dining room. And then you have an open area. In number 8, you have this kind of open air garden area, and that's referred to as the peristyle. So I'm going to show you a specific house so you can get a couple examples. This is the House of Vitile, a very influential family in Pompeii. And we're looking at the fauces, right? So we're looking kind of right in the front, and you can see the water basin area there. And you can see right above it, there was a skylight designed overhead to fill the water basin, right? So where does the water come from? It comes from the sky, right? When it rains. So it's next we see the kind of we can see through there, and you can see how it opens up into the atrium. So we go here, we can see the very back of the house. So this is back where the peristyle is, that open area, that garden area. And this, of course, is a very fancy home. This is not necessarily the size or quite the dimensions of every single home there, but you can also notice that it may be another sign of its fanciness is the colonnade, the Doric columns there, and the colonnade that is kind of going around with those kind of porch spaces underneath. You'll also notice frescoes as surrounding that back space. So frescoes are very common and popular in houses of Pompeii. Most of the houses had the walls painted. So we'll talk a little bit about them. These frescoes. There were four main styles of painting in Roman houses. The idea of these start, as we think, at least in late second century BCE, and then go all the way into that first century AD. This time, over this amount of time, the styles changed a bit. We kind of have these four main ways of talking about them. The first style is known as the masonry style. So that idea is, because it's not actually masonry, but as you can see, the idea of painting the illusion of bricks, right? In this case, it looks like creating different textures. So kind of a faux finish in some ways of the different facades. So on first glance, it actually looks like, on the bottom especially, but maybe even towards the top, it looks like it could be marble or granite stone, but it's actually just a painting. All right, the second style, it's made to look illusionistic pictorially, and this is painted to be as realistic as possible. We often saw landscapes and buildings, like you can kind of see in these images here. And they, of course, added depth to the room. We're looking at a small circular temple there on the right, and this is called Tholos, and it's painted in a realistic way and in a setting that makes us feel almost like we can look out and see from a kind of a set perspective and see in something, right, that's kind of dimensional in front of us. Second style imagery was not just architecture, right? We can see landscapes and kind of vast scenes. We can see in this one, this is a very specific one, we see religious images of people, right? So here this is located in a villa in Pompeii and is known as the Dionysian Mystery Frieze. Dionysius is the god of wine. At the time, there was, in this kind of late Republican era, there were smaller religions known as mystery religions, and they often derived from the Middle East, and they revolved around secret rites or kind of spiritual practices. They were based in a magic or kind of mysticism. So what we are looking at here is some sort of ritual or rite being performed. It involves bathing. That's all we can certainly say. Historians can kind of make guesses here or there, but what we definitely can see just from our eyes is that there's definitely bathing going on or some sort of bathing initiation. But beyond that, we don't know too much more about exactly what's happening, hence the term mystery. But look at the Roman verism if you actually look at the figures here, right? The third style walls, I'll move into in a minute, but just kind of look at those, the realism of the figures, even the kind of ghoul on the far left, they're sticking their head out of what looks like, some sort of long, narrow window. So even there, we're getting kind of wrinkles on the forehead. And again, the character, everyone looks different. We don't have the same face plastered on each figure. I'm going to show you here. This is just another example of the kind of religious rite and practice images. This one also based on Dionysus. So the third style walls are much more decorative. Here we have an example where we see the wall on the left, and then of course the detail of the image we can see on the left, blown up there for you on the right. We see thin columns and in the image on the right, and on the left, we can see those kind of, when we're in that pulled back image of it all, we can see very thin columns that lead up to some sort of, again, thin kind of pediment structure, roof structure there. And at the very detailed but small image at the center on the right, we see kind of It's a villa, a subject of a villa, and it's not. It doesn't have the large illusionistic emphasis that the second style has, but it's more of kind of a small, quiet subject amongst a bigger, kind of more flat, geometric, and kind of simple or minimal structure, a kind of composition there. If we move on to the fourth style, this is kind of like it combines all of the styles, putting into one, right? So this image comes from a room in the house of Witte, and there is just the faux finish of the first style we can see all over, especially at the kind of, if we look at the top and underneath kind of the bottom of the frames of those kind of, all those different frames, we see that kind of illusionistic brick in each, or some sort of finish there. And then of course we have the imagery within those kind of faux frames. We're looking at and we've got the verism, of course, and the figurative elements in the second style. And then the third style, especially if we see on that kind of right side of the left side, so that big white kind of tile there with this image that's in the middle of a patterned exterior. So there's a little bit of everything put into that fourth style. It's very loud. You're looking at a lot of imagery. Here's another example that's a little bit more minimal, but again, we still maintain, even though it's got this one has a lot more influence of the third style, this specific one, but we still see imagery, right? We still see more illusionistic imagery that's a bit bigger within those frames, and also maintains that in all the borders and surrounding borders, we get that first style that finds its way to be faux texture. So this image comes from a fourth style painting. So it's like a one little part of a big wall. And this comes from the house of a couple. The man was thought to be a baker, and he was young. They were a young couple when this volcano would have erupted. So the image comes, like I said, from a four-style wall, where many images would have been placed all around. This one shows newlyweds, and they were showing their status here. The man holds a scroll in his right hand, which is it's a sign of his education, and that was either potentially his real education or what he wanted you to know as his education. He can potentially, if you could pay enough, to have that kind of look. So specifically, the scroll refers to the ability to read. The woman holds what's a little more confusing to see, but it's a wax tablet. So, and that's known as a flageolet, and wax tablets were used to write into. You would press into the wax and then write with those kind of imprints, making the distinction with the imprints. So these two symbols both are showing off status. So the tradition of showing a person holding a tablet was a Greek tradition, actually. Initially, would show poets sitting and holding a book. So this is what we're looking at here, is a Greek poet, Menander, in the house of Menander within Pompeii, again in a fourth style. This is another image of, again, holding something to represent what you are or what your profession is, or potentially some sort of skill set you've got. Here's another one of a woman holding a stylus and a writing tablet, perhaps denoting her own authorship. This motif becomes important to remember when we move forward to the Middle Ages. So by the time of the fourth style, artists are experimenting with painting in a way to really make the subject as illusionistic as possible. Okay, we call this effect trompe-l'oeil, which translates into fool the eye from French. It is a technique to create illusionistic images. Here we see an early attempt to complete this by a painting by painting light passing through water, especially as we see that on the far bottom right. We notice the leaf that we can see through the glass is refracted and in a shifted perspective. We hadn't seen this really before that time, the idea of painting something so specific and so altering, kind of an altered perspective. So the Romans, even more so than the Greeks or the Etruscans, are really, really, really trying to depict the world as it looks. Not just ideally, but also just, again, in something more simplistic like a still life, not just with people that they're trying to elevate or push on you as far as, hey, know this person's important, but also here, as you can see, just with fruit sitting on a surface. So even if they didn't quite master the scale, as you can see, maybe the perspective isn't quite perfect, and maybe the proportions aren't quite just right on that glass. There's still a strong sense of and an attempt of perspective here, and they're pushing it forward in time. They're kind of pushing artists forward and kind of getting them to think. Someone sees this and they think, oh, I can do that a little bit better, right? So they're kind of pushing each other to think about how to make imagery in a more truthful way. Okay, so as we move on and kind of start to think about how time is progressing, here in 44 BCE, the Roman ruler is murdered, right? And this starts a civil war. After the civil war, Caesar is declared a god by the Senate. So Caesar's killed, and then Caesar's declared a god by the Senate. 31 BCE, Octavian defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. In 27 BCE, the Senate confirms the title of Augustus for Octavian. He is considered the princeps, which means the first among equals, and the pontifex maximus, which is the head of the Roman religion. He also becomes the first emperor of Rome. So as you can see through all these titles, we're now getting someone who is considered more of, again, a figurehead, a leader. So though the Senate still exists, like we mentioned, the emperor has the right to choose their successor, okay? So this is starting to happen here. Augustus brings peace and brings huge building commissions. It was said he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Here is a famous portrait of Augustus from Prima Porta. This harkens back to Ole Metelli, the orator, how I ended the Etruscan lecture, right, with a man holding his hand up. And this shows a Roman man of the people, the Ole Metelli, but we know in the past holding up the hand is kind of in a gesture format is a way of kind of signifying communication, right? So here with Augustus we see a similar gesture, but we see a much different meaning. Augustus and subsequent Roman emperors claimed that they could trace their lineage to the gods, something we've definitely known and heard from before, right? So also notice the very base we see Cupid. Who is Cupid? Well, Cupid is the son of the goddess Venus. So all of a sudden now we're bringing gods into images of people. So this is, of course, signifying the idea of royal divine bloodline. It's just hinting at it, but we can look into his armor and see something a little bit even more explicit. So here we see, this is the armor plate of Augustus there, and we can see it's a political message. The direct narrative there is that it's of the military victory over the Parthians, but in 20 BCE, but the image is covered in gods, right? So we can kind of see the labels there. And gods are surrounding the scene. This is an ancient technique, as we've seen before, the stele of Naram Sin. It's one thing to say we have won. It's our victory. It's another thing to suggest it was a divine victory. So, your victory is chosen by the gods, right? Another example of Verism in this time, how it's maybe sliding towards something. We see the eyes, right? And those eyes are kind of all of a sudden a little less specific. And the hair, though it's in a particular part, it's also of a certain style. Things are getting a little bit more closer to what we thought about when we looked at the archaic Greeks or even the Egyptians, where we're getting kind of one look to represent people there. So keep that in mind, because as that slips into Roman, the Verism is still strong throughout culture, but things like this are slipping into culture. This, of course, is Augustus's wife, Livia. This is the monument made to commemorate the peace of Rome. It was made as a birthday gift to Livia there. Augustus is basically present to his wife. It's a kind of shrine with a relief sculpture on the outside. It's a rather simple in structure with an entrance, as we can see all the way through. You can just see the top of the exit, the very top of the exit all the way through. So it's just one entrance, one exit there on either side. A raised platform in the center with the shrine right in there, right in the center. So on the outside of the arch, on all the way around, are reliefs and images that allude to peace and prosperity. The way that Augustus can provide for the people of Rome. This is done through portraying narrative scenes with gods, goddesses, showing concepts of bounty, fertility, and being able to provide. This is an unknown goddess in the center here. She represents two children who could be Romulus and Remus. The two figures on either side are supposed to represent the growth and width, the actual width of the empire, right? The expanse of the empire. Below her are images of grain and livestock, and something we're familiar with since ancient Sumer as a sign of representation, symbols of prosperity. And on the north wall, we have a session of the Senate, and I don't have an image here, but as we see on the south wall, so on the opposite of the north wall, we have a procession of the imperial family. We see the inclusion of children in this image at the very kind of towards the bottom there. This is an important thing because it shows a distinction from Greek relief and imagery, which never would have showed the common man or children. Granted, these are, royalty children, but they're children nonetheless. Apparently, at this time, it was known that there was a fertility problem, and that it's thought that this inclusion of the children here was just a reminder to kind of remind people, kind of keep it in their head, hey, keep trying, keep making children, because we need to keep civilization going, right? But it just is a takeaway. You would never see these kind of expressions necessarily. You would never see young children or just kind of folks, right? More common folks in something that was something more kind of dressed down a little bit. And there was something in that we wouldn't see in Greek culture, because even again, if these folks are, I shouldn't say common, even if these folks are real people that are higher up in society, they're still, again, people we could recognize are real specific people. In the Greek classical, we're only thinking about idealized people, and therefore almost like everyone's godlike when we see them. This is a building from France called Maison Carrée. It's a small temple. It is not different from the temple Porthemus, which we looked at in the beginning of this lecture. It once again displays the hybrid of Greek and Etruscan temples. You notice the engaged columns there on the side, the back side, and with Corinthian capitals on the top. This time, the architect is named Vitruvius, and he's really the most important part of showing this temple. It's believed that his belief was that a building should be form over function, and there shouldn't be too much unnecessary decoration. So he becomes a very famous architect, and he becomes very influential. So he's just an important name to remember. He hated the decorative third style that we just looked at, right, where it was much more about those kind of designs and then kind of minimal inclusion of more, again, decorative imagery instead of imagery that was representing and doing a specific practical, perhaps, illusion. So he believed in perfect proportions, going back to those Greek kind of Greek ideals, and also he believed in mathematical ideals, right? So his idea wasn't necessarily the humanism, but was bringing in that idea of have 2 and 2 equal 4, right? Have things that we can see the math of that will be very satisfactory visually. His thoughts are going to be super influential on the Italian Renaissance moving forward. Briefly, though, this is another example of Roman engineering feats. So there are, I'm sorry, I moved too quick. What we're looking at here is a example of Roman engineering feats, 3 tiers of arches on this aqueduct, and roughly 155 feet long. So this structure moved water in a stream across space for the city of Nimes in France. This is not the first aqueduct ever by any means, but it is definitely the most largest, and kind of, again, having that 3-tier system. The aqueducts existed in India and Egypt and the Near East before now. The Romans really started expanding this, and they had, as a culture, just so many more aqueducts than any. Again, it's partly just due to their great expanse, but this is something they would kind of spread across the empire, and it was a way to keep cultures and keep agriculture going in all these different places. Everywhere needs water. So the general takeaway here is that the structure is a feat to act as both an aqueduct and, of course, a bridge over the Gard River there. So next, let's look at the internationally infamous Roman Colosseum, otherwise known as the Flavian Amphitheater. So the Colosseum marks the end of one dynasty and the beginning of another. After Augustus came to Nero, who was a tyrannical, corrupt leader who eventually committed suicide, a new family took over as emperor, and they were called Flavian. So the Flavians construct the Colosseum. They construct the Colosseum on the site of Nero's former palace. So this is pretty rare because usually there's a respect for the leader who came before you, but here there wasn't. They took everything down, and there was a big, very large. Nero had a very large sculpture of himself. So all of this was taken down, and the Colosseum in its place. In its heyday, the Colosseum was a massive structure that seated 50,000 people. So, like the amphitheater in Pompeii, it had a velarium, so that's that fabric cover over the top. We don't see it here, of course, but it would have been just on the exterior there. And this would have shielded folks from the sun. It was about 160 foot tall and almost the same length wide. As you can see, there were 3 stories. I'm going to move down to this image here. We can see there are 3 stories of arcades, right? So that's the multiple. It's an arcade if we see multiple arches, a series of arches, and the 4th story there, which is called an attic, on the top. The arcade on the 2nd and 3rd floors each contained statues. They would have contained statues. We don't see them here, but they would have contained statues. And of course, at the bottom we see what are called Tuscan columns, which is the same as Doric. And on the 2nd floor we have Ionic columns, and on the top we have Corinthian. The building, like most of Rome, was built in concrete. The Colosseum mostly exhibited gladiatorial sport, often blood sport. As we look at sculpture during Flavian leadership, we see a return to verism. So after Augustus, as I said, kind of changed things to more idealized forms, and Nero followed suit, this kind of tyrannical way, Flavian imagery is depicting people in a more accurate light. Here we again see the detail in the hair. We see the kind of much more specific features in the face. Even in just then, of course, how the musculature and the curve of the mouth there looks much more realistic as a result of actually trying to depict a specific person. Okay, as we move into the High Empire in 96 CE, we see an assassination of an emperor called Domitian is assassinated, and it's thought to be due to his extravagant lifestyle and wanting to be addressed as Lord and God. So he is replaced by what is known as the Nerva Antonian dynasty, and Nerva is the first emperor of this line, as chosen by the Senate. This is the time in history where rule, again, just reminding you, where rule by adoption is strongly in there, and the rulers choose their successors. So Nero chooses Trajan, who will then rule by originally from Spain, and this is the first. It's important because this is the first non-Roman born emperor. Trajan's successor Hadrian was a student of Greek culture. We can see a bust there of Hadrian on the right. You can tell his interest in Greek culture based on his beard, right? Based on his beard and his hair, especially though, of course, we can see the resemblance to the Greek statues, the Pericles statue there on the left. He was specifically interested in Greek philosophy, which will connect to another leader coming up soon. So Hadrian's most famous structure, as we look into the architecture of the time, Hadrian's most famous structure is a building called the Pantheon. The Pantheon translates to all the gods, and the building acted as a multifaceted temple. Notice the Greek features in the facade here. We see the Corinthian columns. The building's orientation is constructed into two parts. So I'm going to show you this from overhead. It might be easier to see. You'll notice there's a square porch just in the front there. So as we're looking down from overhead, we can see the kind of rectilinear front there, right, with the roof, kind of triangular, of course, pediment roof. But then in the back, right, with the second part, of course, we'll notice the dome. I'm going to go back here to the front. You'll notice the text on the front of the building. It translates to Marcus Agrippa made this. So the site of this Pantheon was where another temple had been burnt down. And unlike we just talked about after Nero, Marcus Agrippa was more respected. So Romans, of course, usually were very into the ancestral worship, right? And paying honor to those who came before them. So this is no different with the actual emperors, for the most part. And it's what's going on here, right? The respect and keeping the name of the previous, since Marcus Agrippa's temple burnt down, this is kind of putting his name onto the Pantheon, even though this is something made, by a different ruler there. So we have, the diameter. The diameter is some 150 feet across, and this was the largest dome. Look back here. This is the largest dome in the world. So how did the Romans engineer the dome? Well, thinking about a dome, it's basically an arch that is spun 360 degrees. As we mentioned earlier in the lecture, It also operates on the same principle as an arch. The pressure is sublimated outwards and downwards along the length of the dome. So notice that it is thicker. If you see that built, you can see the top image there where you can see it thicker on the bottom edge as we see it kind of cut open, and thinner as it gets to the top. This is because there's less weight there at the top, so you need it to be thinner so it doesn't weigh down in the center. You can also see how there's those kind of indentations on the roof as it goes up, right? You can see this both from the outside, but also if we look at this image from the inside, we can see those indentations all up on those kind of square shapes. Those are all kind of indentation marks right there from the inside. So if we go back there, kind of looking at those indentations, they're called coffers, and the coffers reduce the mass and therefore the weight. But also, they formulated a new type of concrete to make this building work. So it had better weight balance. They didn't have any metal framework inside the concrete like rebar that they do now in our modern construction. So instead they used pebbles and stones to line the interior of the concrete. So of course, if we look at this structure, another interesting and unique part is the hole at the top of the ceiling. This is known as the oculus. What is the weakest part of the dome, right, to hold everything up? Well, you guessed it, it's right in the middle. So by creating this basically other 360-degree arch, this circular shape, they reduce the pressure from the very sitting top. So this ring shape of the oculus acts as a kind of keystone and distributes the weight in a different direction. So now you're getting multiple directions that the weight is being distributed, multiple keystones really, and it's quite an engineering feat that made it at the time one of a kind. Now notice in the I'm going to go back one. We can see on the left side of the top image this colonnade there on the left, and then there's a porch kind of underneath that, of course, that we talked about. That would have been the front component, and of course the rotunda within the dome. So those are three distinct parts, right? So each separate section is meant to represent a gradual movement towards the more spiritual. Okay, so the idea of the most spiritual would be inside the dome, which we're seeing there. That kind of a magical experience of looking up and expecting some column to hold that up, but it doesn't, right? So that would have been so amazing at the time to just see a ceiling without some sort of postlental or column structure or arch structure that was being held up by columns, but rather this kind of seemingly magical ceiling, right? Especially the height of it. This, of course, was to each separate section, rather, being this kind of gradual rise into the spiritual, into the more elemental, is done through the geometry, right? It's done through kind of going from rectilinear and rectangles to curvilinear circles, right? So the influential architect Vitruvius, which we talked about just a minute ago, he believed in geometry always had a specific meaning. So he said he thought squares represented the earth and the corners of the earth, right? The idea of people being spread out to those corners of the earth, and that spheres represented the heavens. So the making of this building followed his beliefs and designed this structure to be a square and a circle. And of course, you see these two shapes everywhere you're looking. I'm going to go here for another image there, and you can just see, of course, even on the ground, though this is a reconstruction, this is a photograph, but the floor had to be changed at one point, but the floor that we're seeing here is a remake, basically, of the original floor, and we can see those squares and circles. I'm sure as you look throughout, you can see many examples of squares and circles. in general, this idea of kind of combining the earthly world and the divine world and where they're going to kind of come together. So inside the coffers, there were those squares there that we're seeing from the inside here. There were actually stars painted on there to represent, of course, the sky. And the oculus kind of served two purposes, right? The first was a practical weight-bearing one, like we talked about. And the second was the significance of an opening into the high heavens above. Now, last question or thing you might be talking about the Parthenon is, what about weather? What about, what's going to happen when it rains? Well, the Romans considered this as well and built the floor at an angle so it would run into and kind of drain into the side. I can show you here. If we look there in the bottom underneath the atrium there, you can see those kind of black rectangles on the very side of the edge. Those were draining holes, right? So it was the floor was tilted slightly down towards us there, and the water would then go into the drain. The Romans thought of everything. So, just showing you one more image of the floor, as you can see, and how that influenced there into a version into the Guggenheim. Rome was a massive city with over 1 million people living in it. 90% of Romans lived in insulae, which are like apartment buildings. They typically had communal kitchens and bathrooms, but besides this, surprisingly modern in their construction. Just like Pompeii, they had, it was very common to have mural frescoes in the interiors or the ceilings. The next point I want to make is about, so we're talking about here kind of common folks and where they lived in Rome. Next point I want to make is about those folks. And as I'm going to give you a second to look here at a fresco in the ceiling of an insulae. Okay, so let's look at some art here of common Romans. This is a funerary relief of a vegetable vendor. You'll notice the lack of verism here. So we went from verism to losing verism to now coming back to it. And but we're seeing some of it leave a little bit. The proportions are kind of off. You'll see how big the hand is, for instance, compared to the body. The head feels a little bit large as well compared to that those shoulders. And just in general, it's disjointed, right? And some of this might come from a lack of training and education, and some of it could also come from a lack, just less interest in this kind of Greek humanism approach, right? That everyone should seem proportional and perfect. I highlight this difference because as we move on here, the art of the common people gradually becomes just more important and something to focus on. Here is an apotheosis from the base of the column of Antonius Pius, and this is one side. We see more of a typical Roman apotheosis scene, and of course apotheosis is elevation of man to God, so we of course see the it happening there in the center, but less to talk about the subject here and more to talk about the style. So here we see again the style where we're seeing some verisms, definitely some characteristic and character to the different people. They look like they all have different faces, and their proportions seem accurate to humans that we would consider whether they're in great athletic shape like this or not. Their bodies are bending and seem real. We go to the other side. So this is just the flip side of this base. You'll notice the scale. That's really the first thing I want to talk about. I mean, look at the horses and the men riding them. They look almost like they're the same size. Like if the man jumped off the horse and were going all fours, that he'd be the same size as those horses. The hands are quite large compared to their bodies, and again compared to their arms. And again, just things seem off in representation. So this was done on purpose. This is done here to appease and relate to what is now a growing and an unhappy kind of working class by using what is thought to be in their language, right, in their style of art. So the two sides of one column are targeting two separate audiences. Here we've got right, the upper class elites probably, and the idea of going back to what they might be reading in Greek literature and Greek humanism. And here we have more kind of common folk who are, where we've got kind of less proportions, squat figures, and it is less about getting things just right. Reason I'm showing you this and kind of highlighting it is the spread of Christianity is starting to happen here. And it's starting to happen specifically through the lower classes. And this was going to affect how art changes as we move forward. So it starts where the emperors are making kind of concessions to appeal to the working classes in what otherwise seems like a formal imperial format. Now, again, we just haven't seen that happen in the cultures we've looked at. We've seen cultures and empires kind of fall, but we haven't seen it the leaders try to appeal in any way to their constituents in this kind of manner, especially with public art. Next is an image of Marcus Aurelius on horseback. And Marcus Aurelius, as I alluded to earlier, is a philosopher emperor who was known for treating his people well and for his Stoic philosophy book called Meditations. Here he stressed in the book living life by focusing on logic over emotions. A famous quote from it is, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." So this sculpture is important because horseback portraits, equestrian portraits, were common in Rome, and this is actually the last one left, as many were destroyed in early Christianity. This one survived by mistake because it was confused for an image of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. So usually equestrian portraits were symbols of power and strength and confidence, but notice his expression here in his face. It is one of perhaps worry or internal struggle, not the kind of certainty of a victorious ruler. Going to move on here. A development under A development under Trajan and Hadrian is Romans begin to favor burial over cremation. In Egypt, of course, there was a long tradition of burial. Here we see the work of Leia, of Cyzicus, and she's a female painter and artist, and was more rare, of course, to know about and kind of have them female artists named at this time. Egypt was under Roman rule, of course, so we see the merge of the Greek and Roman realism here in the painting, and we also, though, see the stylized, if we look in the kind of the body of the coffin, we see that stylized Egyptian figurative work. We see those kind of profile views, of course, and composite views, of course. The portraits that we're looking at here, there's another one, are from this is also from this one's on a coffin as well. These portraits are made on wood, and the paint is a paint called encaustic, which is based in wax. You would mix the pigments wherever you get the pigments from, which could be from a variety of sources, and you would then mix them with wax, and the wax would dry and adhere to the wood. Here we see yet another painting. Okay, after the Antonine dynasty, and we have the Severins that take rule. And these rulers were notably not as successful, and many historians see this as kind of the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire in this dynasty. So here we see A couple rulers' portraits. I'll show you here one. This is Caracalla, and then the second here of Trajan Decius. And if we look back at Caracalla, there's this anger, right? There's a very furrowed brow. And we go to our friend Trajan Decius here. He seems very worried, right? There's this kind of doubt to him. These expressions seem a long way off from the confidence and sureness of Augustus, right? From the beginning of our lecture, right? We have this kind of everything's going the way I want it to. This perfect idealism of the expression of the confidence and everything. Here we have two people that are seeming maybe the anger and the insecurity there, and the almost the fear. It's the doubt in kind of leading into fear there, right? So we begin to see changes and the rejection of classicism happening in Roman art. This is Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. And here we see, of course, a battle happening. Notice the complete lack, though, of negative space. It's just a complete kind of collage of bodies. In classical art, there was formal order. There is a space between the figure, creating a kind of a visual logic to something, right? Kind of that way we can compare the figure to something else, to even if it's just space, because we can see how the figure situates in space. The importance of an individual figure, because that's humanism, the importance of one person over another. And any one person could matter, right? But here it seems like they're all, we've got arms and legs, and it's kind of hard to decipher between different people. And that's complete. All the humanism is lost here. So this looks like, of course, within the battle scene, on the base of the column itself, it's mentioned for it's intended for these lower classes. So there's chaos. The proportions are less exact, and the kind of there's a figure toward to the top, very top row, and towards the middle, he's extending his arm, and he kind of is, again, towards the middle. This arm is bending to our left kind of side of the view, and that arm seems like it is not in the right proportion. So the more you look, the more you see things are a little off. Things are a little starting to become a little wonky in their display and their make. Here's another example of what I'm talking about. Right now, here we have almost, not quite, but almost composite views. We have people tilting their head completely one direction, but their body's facing us. We also have much different, again, kind of proportions in the hands, and heads are very big, and everything's becoming a lot more squat in the just general body shape. In the late empire, we see the empire split into two. So there's an east and a west side of the empire with two rulers for each side. The ruling structure was known as the Tetrarchy. And here we see from 305 CE a sculpture representing the four rulers of the Tetrarchy. Notice the faces, and especially the kind of bulging eyes here. Everyone has the same face. Everyone's got the same eyes. That reminds us of what? The archaic, right? The archaic Greek and Etruscans. So they seem to look, like I say, all almost exactly the same expression, almost just kind of the same face, just tilted in different ways. So 600 years really since this archaic time, and you see they're kind of going back to something here. Notice that squat and kind of unspecific bodies, there's no longer the correct and exact proportions, right? You'll also notice just from this image, these four tetrarchs are shown embracing each other, which was probably a way to show it was intended to, I'm sure, to show their idea of unity, but instead it really looks more like fear, or kind of, if it is camaraderie, it's camaraderie in the moment of a threat, right? It's kind of coming together because they're trying to use each other, almost like they're trying to shield each other from something. So I think there's a real sense of kind of panic to these images. They do not look like they're in control, but rather they look like they're kind of moving away from something that's threatening them, which is just important to take in, because that seems like historically what's to come. So lastly, I'm just going to talk about at the end of here at the lecture, just about Constantine, who was the tetrarch who got into a skirmish with Maxentius, who claimed his right to, who also kind of claimed his right to the throne. But in 312 CE, at the Battle of Mevilian Bridge, Constantine defeats Maxentius, and he ushers in Christianity. So by the 4th century already, Christianity is spreading within the lower classes and becoming, throughout the Roman Empire, becoming an important religion. So after his battle, Constantine was said to have proclaimed that he had a dream and his army themselves fought under the power of Christ. It was not until his deathbed that Constantine officially converted to Christianity, but his wife and daughter were converted during his lifetime. So this image is of his triumphal arch, and it's split into 3 subsections here. As we see on the right, on the center, and the left, and that is meant to represent the Holy Trinity, right? The Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. At the top frieze, I'm going to kind of zoom in here, and we see this in the figures. We see this kind of squat, out of proportion, generic look to the figures. So even though this is the important figures, we've lost Constantine's head there. Eventually, at one point it was chipped off, but even in the figures we see, they are looking very similar. Even though they're important people, they're not just commoners that look similar. They are important people. They're emperors. They're all kind of former emperors there. So in this scene, he's passing out food and coins and is, therefore a bountiful ruler. The figure on the far right in this image is Marcus Aurelius. And then 3 from the left is Hadrian, and 2 renowned rulers. So here Constantine does the age-old strategy of power by association, right? If you like these guys, you'll like me. Lastly, here I'm going to show you a bust, right? It's kind of a portrait sculpture of Constantine from his Basilica Nova in Rome. And despite its size, which is over 8.5 feet just there of his head, besides that, we notice again there is, right, archaic features, bulging eyes, which harken back to the stylized images, the ones that we kind of got used to in Egypt, right? And just less specificity. And so as humanity, as times are shifting into a Christian era, we notice there is something going on. There's this kind of interest in making everyone one, and kind of why that is we'll go more into. Thank you very much.